Not long ago, a priest with whom I attended high school seminary shared with me this observation. He said, "In all our years of seminary and priesthood, the only year of peace we ever had was our first. For the last 50 years, all we have had in the church is contention, argument, division, dissent, and even schism." End of quote. I recalled his lament when just recently I read a brief essay by a respected Catholic historian. He wrote that people were writing to him increasingly to express their exhaustion in these or similar words, and I quote him, "I can't take the controversies in the Vatican, the American Church, American politics, American society anymore. I just want to live a peaceful life, practicing the faith and caring for the family, free from all that." End of quote. This is a prevailing sentiment in our parishioners and the clergy. Priests have left the priesthood because of this befuddlement, or at least used it as an excuse. Couples have separated and divorced because there is no peace in their lives. The church, intended to be a bulwark and foundation, a standard, is appearing to show signs of weakness, division, and confusion in its members and its leaders. From sexual scandals to the financial improprieties to questionable theological statements, clerics have been discredited, and the faithful wonder what is happening. After all, if the church cannot speak clearly and definitively about fundamentals, like the meaning of love, life, death, and marriage, then who will? All too often they conclude that it is better just to stay home. Exhaustion and fatigue lead to discouragement and loss of hope. So where do we turn? I would suggest we look to our great saints. They lived in times of trial and persecution. What did they say? I think St. Paul is a good example. St. Paul, writing to the Galatians, addressed discouragement. He wrote, and I quote, "Let us not grow tired of doing good, for in due time we shall reap our harvest, if we do not give up." End of quote from Galatians chapter 6, verse 9. When I was a young priest, my first pastor in times of trial always repeated these words of St. Paul, paraphrased by others like Churchill. "Never give up," he would say. "Never, never, never." The apostles admonish us to look to the future. Things will improve. However, St. Paul is not giving the Galatians a pep talk. Instead, as the earlier historian I cited pointed out, fatigue is a mood, not an end. Fatigue is nothing new, and it arises when people feel overwhelmed and cease looking to the future hope. This hope is the reason we never give up. We should learn from what has happened in earlier ages of the church, like the one in which St. Paul lived. To do so, we need to look at a pagan historian's view of that period. Tacitus was his name, and in his Annals of Imperial Rome, Tacitus described how Emperor Nero had used first-century Christians as scapegoats. The emperor blamed them for a tragic fire that had devastated Rome. He could get away with doing this because pagan Romans already suspected Christians of practicing all sorts of abominations and depravity. They accused Christians, in the words of Tacitus, of, and I quote, "hatred against mankind." Nothing is new. History is filled with accounts of potentates, dictators, and pundits who have used public opinion against Christians. This was the world of St. Paul, and it is ours as well. So where do they and where do we find peace? St. Paul would say, in doing good. This simply means a life of virtue. This is what our faithful need to hear. It is certainly what they need to see and what we need to practice. There is little, if anything, an average Catholic can do about a synod in Germany accusations of mismanagement of Vatican finances, renewal of a Vatican accord with China, whether Traditionis Custodes negates Summorum Pontificum. These are important issues, but the Catholic can have an opinion about all or some of them, express it if he or she chooses, and certainly pray. However, what is more important is that we look into ourselves, reform our lives, and do good. While on the topic of St. Paul, I would like to cite another example of his advice in times of chaos. In the second letter to the Thessalonians, St. Paul reassured troubled Christians in Thessalonica. They were disturbed because of purported messages from St. Paul announcing the imminent return of Christ. St. Paul admonishes them, quote, not to be shaken out of their minds or alarmed. Let no one deceive you, Paul continues, and concludes, stand firm and hold fast to the traditions that you were taught either by an oral statement or by a letter of ours. End of quote. In other words, remain faithful to the truth of what you were taught. That's good advice. Let us turn to another saint who lived in a troubled world. St. Augustine had this advice for people lamenting their times. He wrote in one of his sermons, bad times, hard times, this is what people keep saying, but let us live well and times shall be good. We are the times. Such as we are, such are the times. St. Augustine and St. Paul both understood that the best way to live in troubled times is to do what is right. In our diocese, we are preoccupied with hurricane recovery. At the same time, there are outside problems that bring much anguish to our people and to us. This can be the cause of many sleepless nights. We must take one day at a time. Consider the Sermon on the Mount. From Matthew chapter 6, do not worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow will take care of itself. Sufficient for a day is its own evil. One more trial is just one more burden. But in the end, I have learned that evil never wins unless we allow it to prevail. The question that needs to be asked is, do I have my own house in order? Things may be turbulent outside, but if calm prevails within, then we are at peace. This is as true of a parish as it is of a family or a diocese or a nation. Let us not grow tired of doing good, and stand firm and hold fast to the truth that we were taught.